We are live here on Plus One EXP's Roll for Content channel. My name is Tony Vicenda. I'm going to move this microphone around a little bit, see what that does. Sorry if that makes weird noises for everybody. I'm the Chief Alchemist here at Plus One EXP. We're a weird little brand that multi-classes in tabletop game design, beard and skincare alchemy, and the Bardic College of Content Creation. Our hope and desire is to help amazing designers find great players who love their games and help amazing players find great designers whose games they can love. We do that in a lot of different ways, sometimes through actual plays, sometimes through short reviews over on our YouTube channel, which you can find a link to below. But one of the ways that I love to do it is actually just to sit down with people and talk about the work they do, the games they're making. Lots of times we'll pick a project that's live right now. And today we're doing exactly that with Sam Sorensen. Sam, tell people who you are, what you do, where they can find you online, but also tell us the elevator pitch for SeasofSandks, which is live right now.
Great. My name's Sam Sorensen. I'm a grad student and game designer, primarily in role-playing games, though I occasionally dip my toes into other things. You can find me on Twitter at headofthegoat. You can also check out my super cool blogspot blog, caput-capre, head of the goat in Latin, because I'm a big nerd. The elevator pitch for Seas of Sand is that it is an old school toolbox setting guide, but a vast ocean of liquid sand. During the day, the seas of desert are liquid and you sail across them. At night, the sands cool and harden and ships freeze in place, but you can walk across them. Players are merchants and explorers and, of course, pirates sailing across a giant desert ocean in search of trouble and mayhem and hopefully riches.
Awesome. And it's live right now. If you go to ttrpg.link/SeasofSandks, it'll take you right there. I'll drop that link in Twitch in just 1 second. If you're watching on YouTube or on Facebook, it's in the description also too, for you to just click right on. So Sam, before we dive into Seas of Sands in depth, before we talk about creating toolkits, system cross-pollination, some other pieces, let's talk to specifically about you and how you got started playing role-playing games. So what was the beginning of your games journey?
I had the legendary cool art teacher who ran the Dungeons and Dragons Club in 5th grade. And so my first ever session was some kind of horrible mashup of 3rd and 3.5, playing, I think, a DCC adventure I figured out many years later when I was about 10 years old, which went about as you would expect, in that we played for about 3 sessions and it was chaos. And we all loved it. And I'm sure my art teacher, DM, was horrified the entire time. But we had a great time doing it.
I don't know. If they picked a DCC adventure, I think they knew what they were doing. Like they were like, "Can I start a DCC club?" And they were like, "What's that?" And they were like, "All the things you think are horrible about Dungeons and Dragons, but more of that."
Exactly.
With more obscure die. And then they were like, "Absolutely not." They were like, "How about Dungeons?" It was a very calculated thing. I'm sure.
Yes.
And so,
so we played a few sessions of that, and then from then on, I tried to dabble on and off, like people do in middle school. And then I really started playing role-playing games again seriously with the somewhat misled choice of Shadowrun 4th edition in high school, which was, again, went about as well as you would expect it to. Although I learned a lot from that, and I, like all people who play Shadowrun, I love Shadowrun, but I hate Shadowrun. And then eventually I wound up in college getting more into, standard D&D, and from there branched out into story games and the OSR and all kinds of other newfangled dangerous ideas.
That's awesome. And what are you playing a lot like right now, besides in a sandbox of your own creation? What are you playing around?
Other than a sandbox of my own creation, currently I've been playing Band of Blades, Strauss, Asimovic, and John LeBoeuf Little's Blades in the Dark hack, which is very interesting. And I've also been dipping my toes into that new the new quick start for Magpie's Avatar RPG, which I just was in one of their playtests last night.
I get to be in one of their playtests tomorrow.
Yeah, it's exciting. It's cool.
Yeah, I am super excited about it. Every play report I had seen for it had been so glowing by people I just love and adore. I was like, all right, who do I know who can get me into this? And Kate from Magpie was like, it's me, and was like, here you go.
Yeah, we love Kate.
And so Kate's phenomenal. And so, but yeah, no, that's been. I'm super looking forward to that tomorrow. What era did you play in?
We were in the 100 Years' War, so towards the 15 years before the start of the first show. So
Awesome.
So things were terrible. The Fire Nation was taking over. We were like a band of hodgepodge, maybe resistance fighters, though that's a strong term for the chaos that we were doing.
That's awesome. We are playing Kiyoshi era, so I'm
Oh,
super
that's
excited. We're
exciting.
doing
Dig
I was
into the
like,
lore.
oh yeah, I was like, oh man, I am probably nowhere near enough of a fan to say this, but let's just go to the Kiyoshi era where I'm
Yeah,
generally aware that this is a thing and what's happening, but not anywhere near specific because then
yeah,
I'll feel less hemmed in by any choices that we make. So,
yeah, yeah.
no, that's awesome. No, that's great. So you've been playing games for a long time. Where did you get started in design? Is this, you said I know you've done a couple of Zine Quest projects. You've got SeasofSandks up
Yes.
right now.
Yeah.
What led you to I'm playing and running to I want to start designing games?
Um, mostly the same thing that's always been the case for me with game design is I play a game and I'm like, wow, I would like this a lot more if these 6 things were different. So I started out, as many people do, of making some truly awful 5e homebrew, um, and then progressively, slightly, at least I like to think, slightly less awful 5e homebrew. And then eventually that led me to, um, some other role-playing games. I was taking, so I study game design. I'm a grad student in game design, and one of my professors in undergrad taught like a role-playing games class. And so I was in that class, and that got me to read a lot of other ones, and that landed me on Apocalypse World. And so like one of my first bigger projects was a hack Apocalypse World called Rust Hulks, which was like a sort of a grungy sci-fi project. And so basically nowadays, from the moment I open a book, I'm like, oh, I want to hack this and tweak this and adjust this. And so my start was kind of just in like, what if we added this class, or what if we changed these mechanics, or what if we tweaked the way this worked, or what if I mean, it always starts with writing your own homebrew adventures, right? Of like, oh, I don't want to use this prefab dungeon, I want to make my own dungeon. And then from there, pretty quickly, it's not hard to get into custom content and new player options and new campaign choices. And then pretty quickly you have some kind of hodgepodge system, and then you're writing new things, and eventually you're like, hey, I could make $10 on this, and you put it somewhere and make 15.
Yeah. Call from the chat says Glog represent.
Yeah, Glog represent, absolutely.
I was about to say I don't know what that is, but I was assuming you might. And so no, it's awesome. What's the worst horrible 5e homebrew thing you remember doing?
Oh boy.
What horrible abomination did you unleash upon the table?
I wrote a class, I believe it was called the Sanguine. It was a blood mage who had an entirely separate currency, distinct from both spell slots and anything else, that went from, I think, 0 to 50. And they got it based on some kind of horrible derivation of the damage they dealt. And then I made 2 overlapping subclass trees. So there were theoretically like 4 different options you could take, each of which had its own complications. I think this class was about 12 pages long by the time it was done. and I think never got any higher than about level 3, but was just like a true mess of like mathematical abilities and like just garbage layered on top of itself.
Awesome. Was there anything in that homebrew time that you were like, man, I would really love to pull that back out and noodle with it either for another system or for D&D at some point?
I mean, I wrote, so one of the first big like public release, I guess you might say, was I wrote a little like wilderness survival guide. It was like 10 or 15 pages for 5e, that did reasonably well in like the DM's Guild back in the day, which then eventually got turned into a whole like setting. Wait, do I have this on my shelf? Yeah, I do. Here, this book. This is my last big project from last summer called, you can't really read this, Azerians Anchoring in the West Marches. So I ran a West Marches game using those survival rules that eventually grew into a whole like hardcover third-party book.
That's cool.
So that was probably the biggest kind of like single growth project, but I'm always noodling around with ideas,
Yeah. And so now you talked about one of the things you mentioned right before we went live is just like talking about system cross-pollination, and I love that idea. Let's talk a little bit more about that. For people who may not be familiar with the term, what does system cross-pollination mean?
So I guess I should say it's not a formal term. It's just the slang that I use. But basically, I mean, in sort of the current sort of RPG scenes, there tends to be something of an idea that like, if you're playing trad games, like if you're playing, I mean, you see this in trad games all the time, traditional games of, 5th edition is not compatible with 3.5, which is not compatible with Shadowrun, which is not compatible with Vampire, and so on. So there's that. And then more broadly, like in terms of kind of like scene design, you see kind of like the post-Forge, post-G+, like PBTA, Forge in the Dark kind of scene of like very kind of like narratively focused, or at least ostensibly narratively focused, tightly designed. You have your sort of like itch.io, like lyric games, journal games, epistolary games. You have your OSR, like everything has to be compatible within itself, but not compatible outside of that. And then you have sort of the even more strange, esoteric, like war game crossovers and like divination games, like other kinds of things. And so the notion of cross-pollination in a very broad way just means like, what if we take some things that are very common in, say, the Power by the Apocalypse style games and bring them into an OSR context? Or what if we take the death and dismemberment table from an OSR game and we stick it into Apocalypse World? Or what if we take the idea of epistolary questions of saying you write letters to somebody and then say that the letters you write to each other's PCs across a campaign have some impact or something like that. So it's the idea of saying taking mechanical genre tropes, not like narrative genre tropes of superheroes or whatever, but the idea of in PBTA games, a huge thing is asking questions of the GM directly. There are lots and lots of moves where you say roll this and then ask 2 questions of the GM to which they'll answer honestly. And that idea of sort of meta-textual questions of it's not the player character asking questions, it is the player asking a question then their character knows, is sort of anathema in OSR circles. But in the right context, I find it can be extremely powerful to say you get to ask a question directly and the GM will reply. And that is so, I mean, I say revolutionary and that's over exaggerating, but I mean it's such a novel idea to say you can kind of blur the lines between what's metagaming or what's outside the context of the narrative of the game and what isn't. That kind of blur is very sort of newfangled in the OSR context, at least in most systems. But a little bit of that, dashes here and there, can be very powerful.
Yeah, well, it's really interesting, that specific example, because it is, OSR is one of the few spaces where the reality of metagaming, and Chris Bissett posted a long, great thread on.
Yeah, I saw this thread.
Yeah, on metagaming being good. And I had the experience last week of having a blast going and playing in person with some people who were all vaccinated for the first time in almost 2 years, because we moved right before the world shut down.
Yeah.
And so it was a blast. And I realized there are 2 types of metagaming only that bother me, because I'm also there's no the best stories come in play when everybody's playing a little bit on simultaneous actions mirroring each other up to a great narrative point, especially potentially when the party is split, which is absolutely metagaming, but rarely bothers anybody at the table, because we're this is so narratively satisfying, and we can see and hope, if the roles continue to go our way, how these things are going to coalesce at the end. And if not, then we'll deal with the tragedy of somebody showing up and the other person not being there. We're all very comfortable with that. And in OSR, where there's character knowledge is not really a thing, right? There's just player knowledge, where the player knows that, but the concept of just asking the GM is, like you said, kind of oftentimes viewed as anathema, I think is so interesting, because there is this kind of conceit of, I think people think of that meaning okay, where is the hidden treasure in this room? Which may not be the fun thing to ask. What is valuable here would be a better PBTA type question, or not is this monster, this slime monster, going to hurt me, but what is the danger I'm missing? Those are fun questions, and in an OSR setting can be really, really fun to be able to ask. We Down We Go, our house system that we've been developing, that I've been just having a blast playing with. It's designed by Marcus Linderum. He created this lore as loot kind of concept, where as you're going into a dungeon, you ask the players some rumors about what they've heard about that dungeon, and the good stuff in that dungeon is then generated based on the answers that they give, and a roll that then determines how accurate those rumors were or were not. If they were very accurate, or maybe they were inaccurate, but now the item is significantly more powerful than what they've been led to believe. And we played through it in the public playtest, and it was, Marcus started doing it. I didn't know, I'm doing dev on the game, be a thing, but it was so refreshing. And as a GM, it was I don't have to figure out what cool stuff is in this dungeon. I'm going to ask you to tell me about the thief of this legendary party of adventurers, and something you tell me about them is going to reflect about an item you're going to find on that thief's dead corpse down in this dungeon, right? It was a very cool reverse moment, and it was very PBTA of he had left this hole of what's the cool loot in this mega dungeon we're going through, not to be filled in by a player asking him, but by him asking a player. And it was a very, very cool moment that I was I love that. But I also know there are a lot of OSR people who should have been a random table, And the good news is there's still a random table to determine how accurate they are, so it's okay. But what are some other examples like that in your own design, where you've been able to maybe do a little bit of system cross-pollination?
Oh, that's a good question. Of course, as soon as you mentioned it, my brain vacates itself. So I wrote a a rant on my blog. It was one of the first things I did, and I this is gonna reveal how much of a deep into the scene kind of just dredge I am. But it basically, I was saying that I love Gandalf, right? Gandalf is one of my favorite characters ever. The classic wizard archetype is amazing, but I usually hate D&D wizards. I think that they don't feel like Gandalf to me.
Right.
And there's that famous post from way back when on whatever forum it was where they say like, oh, Gandalf's not a wizard. He's an 18th level fighter with like these feats and like a wizard dipped for 2 levels. And my argument was that like, then that means that it's not that Gandalf is a fighter. It means that D&D is doing a poor job of representing what a wizard should be. And so I wrote this class that now is called the Sage for Glog. Shout out to the Glog. Which basically is like a notion of like, what if you played a character who was just really smart? Like, what if their whole gimmick was like they're just very clever and wise? And so there's kind of one of their central mechanics is they have these unanswered questions. And so at any time, the player can write down like a big unanswered question of like, why would the Baron of Zantermere betray us? Or like, who is the mysterious figure we keep seeing at dawn? Or like, what lies behind the great, like Chalice Rune Iron Door or whatever? And then as they have more and more unanswered questions, this kind of like unanswered stat ticks upward. And then anytime they encounter a great source of knowledge, like maybe it's a huge sunken library, or maybe it's like a venerable ancient being from the previous days, or maybe it's like, the laboratory of a mad alchemist they've just defeated or something, they roll a d6. And if it's under the number of their unanswered questions total, so if you have 5 unanswered questions and you get 3, you get the answer to one of them. And then your unanswered stat resets. And so there's a disconnect there of saying like, it might not be that this library literally has the answer to one of these questions, but maybe you just intuit it anyway, or maybe you discover it, or maybe you get a flash of inspiration, or maybe you can piece it together from the logic. And like, that's very story-gamey. Like, that's very like PBTA to say like, the literal, like, what book you open matters less than like the fact that you get an answer. But what it means in a party of BX classes or whatever is it means that now this Sage character is like very wise and mysterious. They can do the Gandalf thing where they ride to Minas Tirith and they flip through a bunch of books and they discover like, oh, this is the One Ring, or like, they solve problems. And like the beats make sense of, you have unanswered questions, go to place with knowledge, get answers. But it means that there's like an element of like mysticism of like, because the process is not 100% clear, because it's not all 100% grounded in reality, it means that like it makes this character feel sort of like supernaturally intelligent. And that kind of like odd metaphorical crossing of like the abstraction of mechanics to the like mysticism and abstraction of a character's wisdom is very powerful and interesting and kind of like a little bit spooky in a way that I think a lot of most RPG sort of character designs don't get into.
Yeah. Well, and it is one of those things that story games do better that granular games don't, because there's that focus on here's the tactile piece right in front of you, so you know that X is always X is always X is always X, unless the GM decides that it's Y all of a sudden or whatever. But story games and indie games oftentimes tend to be better about just saying like, or not. And the reality is like, I think one of the things I love about OSR, and it's interesting, like the last month I've been able to introduce probably 4 or 5 different players on stream to playing their first OSR game, and some of them came back and then played in the next couple streams we had because they had such a great time the first one. And for them, it's that dawning of like, oh, I thought this was going to be a lot of like me tracking torches and rations and others, and like very math intensive. And it can be like, that can certainly be a part of the way an OSR game works, and oftentimes is to a certain degree. But they were like, I was just amazed by the open narrative quality of an OSR game that they had never experienced before. Right? They had never, in any way, shape, or form, been able to experience. And the biggest differentiation is like, an indie game oftentimes tells you, here's how you tell a story. And this is kind of the reverse of what we were just talking about. Indie games always say like, okay, like for the story, it can always be X or Y or Z, right? It's going to give you a couple of options for that. Whereas OSR games don't give you any of that, which means that you don't just have X or Y or Z. You also have A, B, C, D, all the way down, if you decide to play around in that narrative space, right? Like it's going to be determined a lot by players. There's not the same kind of sharp edges or rails that a story game is going to have, because there's no rules around it. It's actually one of the things that like FKR, like Free Creek and stuff, I think does a really good job of exploring. Which is, for anybody who's watching, is like ancient game stuff, right? Like it's like exploring around with the proto ideas of role-playing games, where you might have a referee or somebody who decides this is what happened, but there's not necessarily a ton of mechanics that support that. And a lot of times like lyric games lean very heavily into this territory. But OSR has, I think, a perfect blend of that. And I think it's really easy to write OSR style games that have that. Like, I always tell people, like, my games are like OSR inspired and indie designed, right? It's not so much that they are OSR games or that they are indie games. They're games I'm writing that, like, I'm going to use a lot of principles of OSR in. There's going to be a good amount of granularity so that you know what the adventure you're supposed to go on looks like. But it's going to be really like a lot of indie mechanics and different ways of thinking about things than your traditional OSR game might present, to encourage that kind of storytelling. storytelling. And so like it's only through that kind of system cross-pollination that you kind of get to some of those interesting places. And I love being able to see some of that. Let's talk a little bit about, with that said, let's talk a little bit about Sea of Sands specifically, and how you got into that. I'm going to pop up, for anybody out there watching, I'm going to pop up in just a second as soon as I remember where exactly to look on my computer. The Kickstarter page itself, as well as we're going to take a look at some of the stuff in the preview, because there are just some really amazing things that you have kind of baked into this, and I can't wait to dive into you. But first and foremost, you launched yesterday, right? You're already about a third of the way to the funding goal. Or did you launch a few days ago? I'm sorry. Did you
launch on Tuesday?
On Tuesday. Sorry, you launched earlier this week, and you're well on your way. About a third of the way there. If you haven't gotten it back yet, I would highly encourage you to. We're hoping to be able to, sometime during the campaign, to schedule an actual play. Also, Sam and I are going to sit down right after this and take a look at scheduling to make that happen. But so if you like what you see, come back and do it. But go back no matter what. So tell us a little bit about Sea of Sands again.
Yeah, so Seas of Sand is a toolbox setting guide for kind of old school style games about a vast ocean of liquid sand. So there's kind of three parts of that, as I mentioned. The first part is that it's old school. So if your game features the 6 usual stats and a lot of backpacking and D20s, Seas will fit in basically with 0 hacking. You have like 2 out of 3 of those if you're running, Mothership or Troika or Freebooters on the Frontier or something weirder. It'll take a little bit of adjusting and modifying and sort of like tweaking to get there, but it should be fairly compatible. A lot of the ideas in it are fairly sort of agnostic. The second idea is a toolbox setting guide. And what I mean by that is that, like, some setting guides, trying to think of an example off the top of my head. The Midderlands is a good example of, like, those are like very preset. They have a big map and they have interesting locations and they have, sort of like things to do and all sorts of things. UVG is another good one of, like, UVG gives you the huge map of the UVG. And when I say Seas as a toolbox setting guide, it sort of is the inverse of that. Of like, it details a setting. It's about a place called the Seas of Sand or one Sea of Sand, but it's designed so you can build your own. I mean, we have a map. Jason Ripplinger, they worked on a fantastic map for that. They're making another one. But that is only one possible configuration. If the Barrier Archipelago is not the Seas of Sand, it's one sort of way it could be. And so what the book details is a whole bunch of stuff that you can put into your setting to tweak and modify and adjust and hack and remix to make it your own. So it's built to be sort of like cannibalized and ripped apart and sort of modified however you want it to be for your own table. And then finally, as I mentioned, it's a giant ocean of liquid sand. So that means that during the day, the sands and dunes are liquid. Ships sail across them, fish swim in them, people will sink and drown in them. And then at night, everything cools and hardens like a sheet of ice. So the dunes freeze in place, ships are stuck, so they can't sail at night. But then, sand pirates can walk across the top of them, or you can send out scouts at night, or, if you want to do other various shenanigans at nighttime, there's all kinds of things you can do. I had in one of my playtests a group of players who stole a ship at 4 p.m, made it about 3 hours outside the city, and they got stuck and were being pursued across land. So they had to torch that ship and run for the hills. It was a chaotic session because they did not realize that the sands were going to get cold, or they had forgotten about it. I'm sure those players watching the stream now are cursing me for making fun of them, but I'm going to do it anyway. So that's the basic pitch of Seas. It's a toolbox setting guide, old school games, and it's about a giant desert that's both ocean and desert.
Awesome. I'm excited. We actually have a great question right off the back by one of our favorite designers, Brian Yaksha, who does a lot of toolbox and says they're genuinely interested in Sea of Sands as a toolbox and will celebrate the concept of desert. That it celebrates the concept of deserts. As a writer of toolbox supplements, Brian always finds 1 or 2 things lacking in their own work, which would have elevated the item to some unknowable height. Brian is curious to know about what sub-biomes of deserts you have, and how specifically they will be designed to allow your players to make their own supplement. Let me restart.
You're good.
Brian is curious to know what sub-biomes of desert you have and how specifically they will be designed to allow for you or your you to make your own supplement or any other desert setting.
Yeah. So the Seas is divided into 7 different kinds of sand. They are, I can rattle these up in memory now: salt, silk, sugar sand, kiln sand, bone sand, Vulcan sand, and king sand, each of which functions in its own separate ways. All the monsters, plants, and phenomena in the book are sorted by the type. So it means that when you're flipping through, there are these little like symbols on the side, and you can say like, if I'm looking at, dire kangaroo rats, they most commonly show up in the lighter sands. They avoid Vulcan sand, they avoid king sand. If you're looking at lichanomorphic jellyfish, those will show up anywhere because they're sea bound. If you look up buried titans, they're much more likely to be found in some of the harder, tougher sands. And so what it means is that there are these 7 kinds you can use, but it's pretty straightforward to add in your own and then think about what kind of like, new creatures and plants would grow there. And each of the 7 sands has their own unique behaviors. So like silk sand, for example, is very light, it's very dusty, which means that it's light and easy to deal with, but you'll drown in it easily. And it means that sailors will sometimes take baths in it. Vulcan sand is explosive. If water touches it, it will burst into impact. So it means when ships sail through them, they have to keep their water supply is very tightly focused. King sand flows in long sort of like river-like tendrils, and it doesn't freeze at night. So it means that they're like popular trade routes, both for merchants and for pirates. So each of the 7 sands encourages slightly different modes of play, slightly different sort of varieties of creatures and things that dwell there. And then when you're planning your route from city to city, you have to think carefully about like what you're going to do. It also means that if you hate 2 of those, you can just rip them out of your game and not put them on the map. It means if you want to add in, 8, 9, 10 different kinds of sand, it's straightforward to do. Things are designed to be modular. Things are designed to be sort of easily replicable if you want to make more, or easily removed if you don't like them.
Yeah. No, I love that. Now, and I think like one of the things that Brian does incredibly well that I also noticed as I was just going through this, like the sand creation process is very iterative as far as what you designed in the quick start that it's up on the screen next to us right now. So this is like silk sand and all the different pieces in it, and you provided some of the same information for every single one of them. So if you want to make that additional type of sand, like you already know, here are a lot of the initial questions you need to answer. I think one of the other interesting parts about Brian's question are what are some of the things right now that you are like, hey, because I think every designer has the things that are like, I wanted to do X, but I'm not good at X, right? Which this is a little bit of like, I'm not asking you to ding yourself too hard or anything, but like, what are some of the things in playing around with this that you're like, this is a question I still want to answer but haven't answered yet, or this is a thing that I really wanted to leave for the players and the GM to decide for themselves, or that just like, oh man, like I'm not good at this part, and I can't wait to see what other people do with it.
Yeah. So one of the things that I've been working relentlessly on with Matt Kay, my editor, is sort of a broader thematic question of like Seas has a pretty strong like pseudo scientific basis of like, yes, sands like this cannot exist, but if they were to, I'm working with one of my best friends. He's a biology major and he studies marine biology. So like, I've been working on creating fairly realistic, like fake biology and things. So Seas has like a very strong like logical basis. And I think in the mercantilism of it, like obviously it's a little bit scrubbed to be like easier for gameplay, but like the mercantile aspects also have a pretty reasonable basis in economics. And so what it means is that Seas, generally speaking, feels like a real place. Obviously it's fantastical, it's mystical, but like it withstands some scrutiny. The broader challenge that me and Matt have been working on is sort of a question of thematic elements of like, what is this about in like a more, I hesitate to use the word literary, but like in a more kind of like broader meaning, like when you sit down from Seas, you're like, oh, this is what this game is sort of reflecting and meditating on. And what we sort of landed on is the idea of the desert as a place of like immense physical hostility of you run out of water, you run out of food, you get lost, you die of dehydration, you die of sunstroke, all these horrible things can happen to you, but also as a place of like sort of like almost transcendence of like, wisdom comes from the desert is something that we get tossed around, to the idea of like there being truth out there in sort of the like ascetic suffering of the question of like in this deprivation, in the removal of things that you take for granted, what can you find? Like what can you get closer to truth? Can you get closer to God? Can you get closer to meaning? Can you find something in all this sort of physical hostility, which I think is possibly, as I say it out loud, a reflection of 2020 of like, is there any meaning in all this, like, all this discomfort? And we've gone back and forth a whole bunch of times on this. And like, I've had half a dozen mechanics and ideas and suggestions and monsters and things that I've ended up scrapping and throwing out because they didn't live up to the satisfaction of what I was looking for. And honestly, we're still struggling on it. That's part of what our development still we're working on, is a question of like, how can we eke out a little bit of thematic question? How can we, the question that Matt asked to me that sort of blew my mind a little bit was like, how does the old school scene meditate? Like, what does it look like mid-session to like reflect on something as you do it? And I don't have a great answer to that. I'm trying things and I'm throwing things with the wall and seeing what sticks. And I think for some people, Seas will resonate. And I think for others, it'll be like, oh yeah, it's a big desert, it's an ocean.
Right. Yeah. So the difference between like it meaning like, hey, the purpose of Seas is I want to drop my players in a desert space and let them mess
Right.
around, right? Or like I loved like what you said, like you kind of dropped Mothership as like, hey, Mothership has 2 out of 3 things that make it easy to touch down
Right.
in a Mothership kind of on Seas as a planet,
Right.
explored around for a little
Yeah.
bit, and then or even 7 planets if you want a bunch of
Sure.
different
Yeah.
desert planets with different types of sand, but explore that space, be horrified by it, and then zoom back off. The stats won't translate as easily, but it's
Yeah.
still got a lot of the flavor in the feel because of that harder scientific edge, and a little bit of that granularity. And I love that concept. But then there's the question of what if that's not what you're looking for, and you are looking for a little bit more of like a Dune-like experience or something
Yeah.
where
Exactly.
what does it mean when your character stands and looks off into the sun setting over the edge of the purple
Exactly.
like king sand, like what out in the desert is calling to them, right? And
Exactly.
going back on and touching back on the earlier part of our conversation, like there is this level indie games ask that question well. Like it's almost
Yeah.
like do each of the sands have a question that when you stare at them you design,
Right.
like they call out of you, that people may choose to say like no, I don't, like I'm not
Yeah.
super interested in
Yeah.
that. Yeah. And so Jeremy Childry is watching over on Facebook. Jeremy says, I know Matt K, cool guy, played in a DCC campaign with him. Also sounds like it would be really cool for Gordnak also too, which I don't know if you're familiar with Jeremy's Mothership setting.
Yes. This is the like
Gordnak.
primeval worlds.
Yeah,
Or
it's
am
like
I?
it's pretty contemporary Mothership, but it's got different races and some different classes in it. We did a stream on the channel earlier, and then like the planet you very early find out has this like oozing substance in it, like that's like oil that's very powerful,
Oh,
but it's
yes, yes,
also
yes. Sorry, I'm getting this confused with something else.
the
Yes,
blood of
I
the
know what you're
planet
talking
that
about now.
wants to kill you also too. So spoilers if you
Yeah.
I should have said beforehand.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's a really cool setting, and some of the different sands and other pieces that you have in there would be really cool additions, and has some very similar vibes to it. Anybody watching, if you have questions about Seas of Sands, OSR toolkits, system settings, how you make those, the things that you wish you were better at when you were making them, please drop them in. Brian, Jeremy, if y'all have more questions, please feel free to keep them coming. If we didn't quite hit an answer to the question you asked, feel free to pop it back to us also too. I am super excited about it. Like we said, let's we looked at like a couple of different types of sand. What are some of the other things that people are going to be able to expect when they're opening up the Seas of Sand supplement or toolkit?
Yeah. So one of the things that took a lot of development that I spent months on over this past year, work trying to get right, is a way to make sort of like mercantilism and trading and like basic economics feel interesting and fun and engaging without getting extremely bogged down either in like tax percentages or in like haggling over fine details. In my early playtests, like players spent a lot of time being like, we have these 2 barrels of, spiced rum, or we have these 2 barrels of like fine silks. And they would spend, an hour at the table arguing with like PCs over getting things. And some players really enjoyed that, but a lot of them felt like they just wanted to get on with the adventure. They wanted to make their checks, they wanted to try and get the prices down, but they didn't want to have to like deal with the questions of it. And so the system that I have sort of devised is a little bit of an abstraction of, it's a little bit sort of like one step removed. And what it's called merchant dice and the merchant roll. And so what it means is that when you go to trade something, you say like, oh, we're selling, this box of spiced peppers. Then you get a number of merchant dice. You get 1 for luck, you get some based on your checks, you get some based on the amount of time you spend looking for good deals, and then you get some from other factors. Quartermasters get extra dice, pirates sometimes get extra dice, and so on. And then you roll all of them at once and you take the highest, and from there's a big list of results. And so if you get like a 20, then you get some huge price bump. If you get like a 19, then it's like, oh, you get a huge price bump, but it's in the next city over. If you get a 15, then it's like, oh, this is just standard price, unfortunately. And if you get like a 3, then it's actually worse. And if you get a 1, then for some other reason, the trade goods here are illegal, and so the authorities will be after you. And so what it means is that like, you as players still have impact, of your stats still matter. There's questions of like, how long do we want to spend in the city, of like, ooh, we can spend a week here, but our crew will start getting restless. And if we can adjust demand, then like we can shift the tables up and down and things. But it also means that like a huge trade deal that, might take 2 weeks of in-game time, at the table, you can be done with that in 20 minutes or even less. And so what that means is that like, you get the interesting inputs of the player decisions matter, and they can adjust demand accordingly and all these things. And you get interesting outputs of, oh, we get a great deal, we get a bunch of skins, or like, oh, we get a terrible deal, we need to move on to the next city or whatever. But that interim time of haggling with NPCs and tracking down the best merchants you can and all of that gets sort of like a little bit black boxed. It all gets a little bit abstracted, it gets a little bit smoothed out, but it's still modular. It's easy to add in more dice. It's easy to adjust the results table. It's easy to say, like, as a GM, I want to tweak the odds in this way without altering things too far away from the. Sorry, I'm tripping over my words here.
Yeah, when we popped the rules up for the merchant roll on the screen next to us, they're part of the quick start that you can get on the Kickstarter page. The link to that's right below us on the screen right now. That ttrpg.link /SeasofSandks will take you right there. Brian has another question, but Jerry just joined us also. Says, what system does this for sound great? This is an OSR toolkit. So it's basically like a setting concept for your favorite OSR system of choice. So like for me, I am very excited to drop our house system into this and play around with it a little bit, which is Down We Go. But like this sounds like it would be very easily compatible with BX, OSE. Do you have a favorite system that you get to play with this, Sam?
Yes, my favorite system, and shout out to all my goblins in the chat, is the GLOG, the Goblin Laws of Gaming, which is a super niche OSR rule set written by Arnold Kemp. And it basically exists only on blogs and on Discord servers. It doesn't have, as far as I know, any really.
Oh, so I was about to Google GLOG.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to find anything.
I mean, if you look up Goblin Punch, you
Goblin
might
Punch,
be able to find it. But it's a pretty niche one. It's sort of, the goblins and Gretchlings who play it are sort of far afield, but it also means that it's, very creative and interesting, and it means everybody's home game GLOG is always a little bit different. But I've also run Seas with, I'm trying to think, I've run it with 5e, I've run it with Knave, I've run it with OSE, I've run it with old school BX, I've run it with Troika, I've run it with, I haven't run it DCC yet. I'm trying to think, have I run any other systems? I don't know. Point is, it's pretty broadly compatible. If you have read like any old school material before, it will be pretty readily identifiable. It's like, I understand what's going on here. Of course, my home system is best, so you should always play mine, which hasn't been publicly released and changes every week, but it's still the best one.
That's the one. That's the one you have to play it with. Well, that's the thing. Like, I was really like, there's a few. I'm like, I do like setting books, and I like being able to pick them up for a few systems, right? Like, I'm somebody who, I think for a long time I was one of those people who was like, who needs an adventure book? Let's just go, right? Like, I'll come up with the general idea, we'll just play, which is great. And I love that I started out with great GMs who modeled, here's how you do, like, here's how you come up with a core concept, but then just improv out around it. It taught me to be a great GM in that regards. I'm learning to love running a book mostly as written, right? Because every time you play it, like you do a little bit of different things, you add some things in. But as we've been playtesting Down We Go, like, I've actually sat down with a dungeon in front of me for the first time ever and just walked people through a dungeon that I wasn't just making up and sketching out as we went along. And so it's been really interesting to kind of step into that space, and I'll read them and other stuff. But one of my favorite other ones that I really think that I see a lot of comparative reality to, and I hope you would take this as a compliment, is Into the Weird and Wild, which just did its second Kickstarter edition. Does for the woods what I feel like Seas of Sand does for the desert. There's definitely some different focuses, not just the biomes, but the procedures that you've added in, the other elements, along with the setting pieces, the world building components, all the other things have some very similar feelings. Like, you were just talking about the merchant role, and it very much feels like the way that gold for survival works in the Weird and the Wild, right? Like, if you want to use this in your game, just pull it out of this toolkit and pop it into any game, because like, you're gonna have weird players like me who are like, no, I have captured and started raising these razor wing bats, but I'm raising them so that I can start a wing shack because I'm an alchemist and I've created this addictive sauce that I can put on the outside of them. And now I've bought that space and I would like to do commerce around that. And that can require a lot of role playing, or you can pop out a merchant system and drop it in as a toolkit and say, oh, great, that's fine, that's wonderful. You can see how your like stuff is going every time we go back to town by rolling this and just seeing how it goes, role play through a little bit, and then move on, so that the rest of the players don't have to deal with your ever expanding razor bat wing empire. And so I think those types of pullable procedures are great. I love the economy being based on, you mentioned it, like water skins, right? The amount of water that somebody needs for a day as the thing of value in the desert, which is great if you're looking at like a science fiction or campaign where you're touching down from somewhere else, is because you're going to be bringing in some real wealth. while simultaneously maybe not having enough of it yourself to be able to do a lot of trading. And so there's a lot of really interesting pieces for that. And so Brian wants to know, what would you consider to be the ideal sort of campaign to run with this toolkit as a GM or a player? I'll ask you that question first before I ask you the second one.
Sure. So for me, Sam, I really enjoy sandbox campaigns. Sandbox. But that's sort of my personal preference. I'm a big fan of saying, like, here is this place. There are some kind of like loose diegetic incentives in place of like, you would like to not starve, you would like to make money, go to, and we'll leave the random encounter tables and we'll leave it to chance and see what happens. And a very kind of like procedural, open-ended sort of like, let's just examine what happens as we go. But I also think for Seas, you could very easily use it as a like, imagining like an arc in a larger campaign of like, we've done the like, Underdark arc, and we've done the Frozen North arc, and now it's time to go do the Desert arc. So we're gonna drop in Seas, and we'll do some things there, and we'll make some friends and go on. You could also pretty easily use it, I think, as like a like if you're going through a random portal and you get dumped to some foreign, exotic, horrible locale, right? Of like, now you're in the desert and suddenly you're being baked alive, and like you adventurers clad in your furs are not at all prepared for this. Or you could use it honestly as like a fairly traditional kind of like, I mean, I can imagine like you keeping the Borderlands in the Seas of you depart from some city and now you're on this desert fort somewhere, and it's altering the way that you are. You have to tweak the module in the adventure. But I think that like, as long as you're willing to say like, yeah, the lower levels of the dungeon are flooded with sand, and instead of finding 1d100 gold pieces, they find 1d100 skins of water. Seas is not too hard to drop your favorite pieces of content in. I know I've been in my campaigns occasionally. I'll drop in a dungeon from Trilemma, which are like they're designed to be pretty hackable. So that's maybe
I think Trilemma dungeons are the height of dungeon design, along with a few other sources.
It's kind of cheating to say like, it was easy to drop in a Trilemma dungeon because Trilemma dungeons are meant to do that. But I mean, I don't think it's hard to tweak sands like you would any setting to fit your broader campaign. At the risk of sounding like I'm trying to sell my product, but I do genuinely think that.
But also, Brian, I think, is familiar with the answering plus selling a little bit conversation. We all may hate it, but we also all understand it's a reality. And so let's talk about Call's question, then we'll come back to Brian's second part of that question. Was there anything in the Sea of Sands that ended up working differently from what you first envisioned as you've gone through playtesting?
Oh, many, many, many things. The biggest and baddest example, honestly, is probably the ship rules. Of when I first started running, I had no rules, and I felt like I was totally lost. And then I wrote a very complicated, like, almost verging on a war game system of like, you have these minute-long turns that are very explicit, and like, here's a big list of 12 actions a ship can take, and like, here are the different roles, and here's where you shift things, and like, here are very precise speeds and turning angles, and all this like complicated math that like, I'm sure I would love to play it as a war game. Like, if we sat down to play ships war game, that'd be fun. But as an RPG, I felt quickly like, within 2 playtests, I was like, wow, this takes so much time. It's so overbearing. I felt like I was playing some kind of, like overbaked trad combat system. Like I felt like I was playing, I mean, I like 4E for other reasons, but I feel like I was playing 4E, but as a ship combat game. And like, that was kind of fun, but it wasn't at all what I wanted. And so I pared those rules down a lot. A lot of the way the sands operated, like in terms of their basic biology, has changed. Way back in the day, originally, they got more liquid as you went further down, and thus there was this like complicated inverse biology scale that involved a lot of like attempting to submarine players that was totally non-functional and like killed 2 parties before I had to change it. All the merchant rules have gone through 3 or 4 different iterations. If you look at my blog, you can see some of the old ones. A lot of the like biology of what kind of animals exist out here has changed. Honestly, at the risk of sounding like a game designer, it would be easier to describe the things in Seas that haven't changed than the things that have.
What hasn't changed in Seas?
In the very first doc, it says, what if it was a desert, but you sailed ships across it? So that has not changed. The very core pitch has not changed.
Which is such an interesting choice, and I want to come back and talk about that some more. It's really great that was the thing that you talked about, because I'd actually pulled up the sandcraft section to talk about, and so I'm glad you already hit that. But Brian's second question was, if you had to advertise to folks who wouldn't otherwise hear or otherwise care about deserts, what about this do you think would win them over to the setting ideas?
If you don't like the idea of a desert, I mean, the easiest pitch here is that it's a naval campaign. If you want to play pirates, if you want to play merchants, if you want to sail across the high seas, this hits that fantasy pretty well. Otherwise, if you just don't like the idea of it being really hot and sweaty, I would lean honestly into the mysticism angle. I would say a desert is a place that truth comes from. I would say there are creatures and phenomena and ideas out there that will alter the way that your characters and maybe you think, maybe not, probably not, but probably, there are things out there that will affect the way in which your character views the world. and the way in which your character behaves, both on a moment to moment and on a broader, sort of like throughout this character's lifetime, how they behave and how they operate.
Awesome.
Yeah, I think that's what I would say.
Awesome. If y'all have more questions, let us know. But I think those are a couple great ones. Also, just keep them coming. Drop in the chat wherever you happen to be watching. I should be able to see them. I was like enthralled by some of the naval ideas. I guess my question that I have, and it probably is covered somewhere near here, how does cities work? Like if the sand turns to liquid on a regular basis?
Yeah.
Tell me about cities.
So there is land in the seas. If you look at Jason's map, you can see there's green islands. So there are like, big, like in my mind, they always look like Arches National Park in Utah. Like they're these big rocky islands that do rise up out of the sand. And so like, it's not all 100% desert. There are archipelagos, there are chains of islands and things. But that said, there are occasionally there's a phenomenon that I'm working on trying to figure out how to codify it in a thorough way, of a city that is built basically on like huge stone supports. So it sinks all the way down to bedrock if it was built either in the ancient days by the sand fairies or through some modern alchemical technology that protects you from the heat. The idea of imagine like a Venetian city of sand canals. So it sits freestanding in the middle of the sea. There's no water, there's no land. They have to import all their food and water, which is a huge cost, but it means you can put them in critical trade locations. So cities primarily function like actual coastal cities do. One of the major inspirations for this historically was like the Venetian Ottoman Wars of the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries. And the idea of you have these intense coastal powers fighting over like trade territories, sometimes in trade wars, sometimes in cold wars, sometimes in hot wars. But the notion of like independent city-states that rule over their nearby coasts of both fishing rights and trade rights, of like the who controls the trade, who controls the spice, controls the universe, right? If it all leans into this idea of saying like, each of these cities is their own independent operating thing that sits on their island, and thus through naval power and desert power, they try to control the rest of the seas.
Awesome.
So that was a really long-winded answer.
No, that's a great answer. I love it. I'm looking forward to getting a chance to play again. We're going to be wrapping up in just a few minutes. If you have more questions, really about anything, even if you've asked a lot of questions before and you're thinking, oh man, I shouldn't ask another one, ask another one. That's 100% while we're here. Before we do that, I just want to let everybody know we do have another stream coming up tonight. We're going to be playing Thursday, which is a time looping RPG inspired by Russian Doll, and Groundhog Day by Eli Seitz. This evening at 8 p.m. we're going to be playing with a few of our friends over in the RPGC, Aaron, Lim, and Sam, who goes by Babblegun Sam on the internet and whose actual last name I should know, but this is our first time having Sam on stream, and I only know Sam by screen names because that's how a lot of us interact with each other. Come on back tonight to watch us get trapped in a time loop and then work in the writer's room to figure out how we achieve an epiphany and create that, escape that also too. So that's going to be tonight. Also, everything we do on the channel here, we don't charge creators for. Lots of times they'll give us review, preview copies, giveaways, other stuff like that. But if you want to help support the channel financially, one of our big goals this month is to create financial stability for the channel. It costs us about $400 a month to run it. We would love to get it up to financially stable. You can go check that out at kofi.com/+1exp. That's my sales pitch. Now let's get back after that to talking a little bit more about Sea of Sands, because it is, like I said, there's a few different like kind of concepts that I'll fall in love with, and Weird in the Wild again is one of my favorite supplements because it so well captures that. I love hearing you talk about the mystical aspects of like, and even asking yourself that, what does that mean? Because for me, one of the things I love about Into the Weird and Wilds is it captures what I experienced as a child, going out into the woods and experiencing wonder, awe, fear, being drawn to the old weird shed in the middle of the woods that no one's quite sure how got there, the weird well that's still there from when people had originally like come in and started building houses in that area. Like there's all those different things that you'll find out in the woods, and there's this sense that captures, and I love that that's something that y'all are trying to capture in this as well. So Will wants to know, if you talk about the strange phenomena creatures that live in the sands, do you have a favorite creature or outcome that you want to flex?
Well, I mean, my favorite creature is probably the worm. The worm. Praise be to the worm. In terms of phenomena, their favorite phenomena. I mean, the one of my favorite ones is called God's Sanding Block, which is a gigantic cube, a mile on each side, that hurtles through the desert at high speeds and crushes anything in its path. It's very straightforward, but it asks interesting questions, I think, on like a little bit more thematic level of like, why, who would create such a thing? Why would this exist? Like, I think like it's called God's standing block ensemble because like, you know, it's a giant standing block, right? It'll crush a city in its path. But you know, at the risk of turning into a theologian on your stream about games, you know, it sort of gets a little bit
it is not uncommon that we turn into theologians, social philosophers, and other things on this stream. So go ahead.
Like it digs a little bit very slightly at the question of evil, right? Of like, you know, if we, you know, take the traditional kind of like monotheistic view of God as like, you know, omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent, like why do bad things happen to good people? Why would God put a gigantic mile-high cube of sandstone hurtling through the desert? Like why does such a thing exist, and what does it mean for us as humans who live on a world where such a thing exists? And like, yes, it's a metaphor, but it also is a giant cube that will crush your ship if you don't get out of the way. So it's very like, you know, it hits the extreme personal physical danger, but then also very distantly asks a few kind of like lingering metaphysical questions that I find so interesting.
Yes, we've got a lot of the worm and then shakas in the chat
excellent
right
excellent shakas in chat for Dune Riders and praise be to the worm.
I love it. Yeah, and I feel like you hit a lot of absolutely amazing touchstones in this, and the challenge with any of that is also then like, how do you hit the touchstones without feeling like, hey, I'm troping this out. I think you did a really good job in the quick start and in the descriptions of opening up to that style of play without saying, oh, we've just dropped something else right in the middle of this environment. And it's a really delicate mean to hit. I think you've done a really phenomenal job with it. Tell us a little bit, just one more time, about the campaign. So y'all launched last Tuesday.
Yeah.
You had a funding goal of $15,000. You're coming up on 7,000. You're a little over 6,500 right now. What are some of your development plans for Seas of Sands?
So I have been badgering away on it for the past year, working full-time on it this past summer since the semester ended for me. I've brought on Matt Kay to be editor, who is very talented and knows all kinds of things that I don't. You know, my good friend Dom Liotti is doing cover art and the art of the worm. My good friend Jason Ripplinger is doing the maps. My good friend Walid Rauda is doing cultural consulting and sensitivity reading. And of course, our dear friends at Exalted Funeral are doing distribution and production. So that's the team behind it. In terms of development, right now, for me, it is a lot of writing and a lot of illustration. The things you see in the quick start are being written, and there's a lot of like empty boxes where it says like illustration, like, you know, 56A, because I am badgering away on those right now. Other than that, it's, you know, writing a whole bunch of monsters, plants, phenomena, content, tables, generative tools, continuing to iterate and develop. Most of these rules, like the mechanics are there, I think. It's just the conveying of them. That's where Matt will come in and say like, hey, this sentence sucks. You need to change the way this works. I don't understand what this means. You need to write this again. So right now, it's a lot of the kind of like developmental iterating of saying, we have this content. You know, the rules are functional. It's all there. That's why I felt comfortable putting in the preview. But it's saying we need to take this text, this book, this artifact, and increase it to a level where anybody can pick it up and understand what's happening. Anybody can read it and be into it. Anybody can really understand what's going on here and be engaged and pull things out of it. So it's lots of the like deep and in design developmental work.
The nerd stuff. And you are looking at a hardback book. What are the pledge options?
Yes. So pledge options, there's a $20 PDF. That's just a PDF. And all these tiers come with digital versions of both the worms and the maps. So if you are worried about not getting those, don't worry, you'll get the digital versions no matter what. So there's a $20 PDF, a $40 hardback. If we get 400 hardcover backers, then we'll upgrade them to get sewn binding, because otherwise that's absurdly expensive. But if we hit 400, then it becomes viable. I'm really hoping for that one because I love sewn books. Mm-hmm. There's a $60 tier that gets you the map. One side of the map is a little bit smaller and labeled. That's the very archipelago you're looking at right now. The other side, me and Jason are deep in development of a much bigger map that has far fewer labels. If you want to add on your own or modify or adjust it, if you want to have a huge ocean. And then at the $80 tier, you get a copy of The Worm, which on the one side has Dom's fantastic art, and then the other side has very detailed sort of like lore and mechanics, inscriptions, how to use it, how it fits into the biomes, how the worm creates the desert, and all of that jazz. That's so awesome. 20, 40, 60, 80. And then if you're a retailer, for any of you retailers watching, there's a $100 tier for 5 hardbacks. If you're not a retailer and you have 5 friends, you really want 5 hardcovers, that's probably fine too. I'm not a cop.
Or just get all 5 of them and back it, because then we might get so binding. Like, that's fine also too.
Exactly.
I'm glad you're not a cop though. The no, I was super stoked to see Dom's name on that. Dom's magic system project. Yes,
Power Words engine.
Power Words.
We're seeing that soon. I'm so stoked.
It's one of the best. I backed that at a high enough level to be able to inject the word beard into the spell table.
Oh, excellent.
And so it was a project that I loved, and my immediate I found it when we were doing zine questing, fell in love with it, told a ton of people about it, and went and immediately messaged Dom and was like, I want this to be more than just something I can drop into another system. I want to play this game.
Yeah.
Let me play this game. And
Yeah.
so, I mean, not with any kind of super backer energy, just with
Sure,
all
sure,
the love
sure.
of like, oh my gosh, like this is such a
Yeah.
great idea. I want a game built around
Yeah.
this Magic system. So phenomenal team, lots of people I love in it also too. So please go check it out if you have not yet. Again, you can go search it on Kickstarter, Seas of Sand, or you can go to ttrpg.link/seasofsandks. Right after we're done here, Sam and I are going to sit down and look at the calendar and try to find a time to play on stream also too, so we get to mess around in this literal sandbox of play using one of our favorite systems. So we'll figure all that out and let y'all know more about that soon. If you have not yet, please hit follow on the channel or subscribe to us over on YouTube. We are at a little over 820 subscribers. We would love to, by the end of the summer, hit that $1,000 mark. There's a lot of cool things that kick in for us then as far as sustainability goes also too, but it just helps other people discover the stream also too. Also, everything goes right over to YouTube. So if you are coming in late and want to see the beginning of this, you can hop over to our YouTube channel right now and watch the beginning of it. Or if you're excited about the project and you think some of your friends might have questions, drop them this also too, or encourage them to go back for just $1 and then ask their questions on the campaign, because that's a great way to find out more information
Also
about
back
a
kit. There's a back
project.
kit. So if you only back for $1 now, you can also pledge late afterwards.
There you go. You get backer kit access too. Yeah. So Trinidad is very excited that they would love to see a live play of it. So we're gonna get that worked out right now in just a second. But until next time, this has been Prestige Class with Sam Sorensen. And until then, class is dismissed.
Thank you so much.